Welcome to the Flex Rental Solutions webinar. Today we're going to be talking about a new feature that will be in version 4.11, and that is our job costing tab. The job costing tab is a really useful tool that you can use to look at your revenue, expenses, and your profit loss for event folders, quotes, invoices, POs, basically any financial element that you have in your system. Again, this is going to be in version 4.11, so you won't see it in your system right now. And we're hoping that we will push version 4.11 by this weekend. If not this weekend, then next week. A lot of times it's difficult to give you an exact date until we're ready to go and until the QA process has been 100% complete. So hoping to push it this weekend, but if it's not this weekend, it will definitely, or at least hopefully, be next week. So let's look at this new job costing tab, what it can do, and the different types of elements that it affects and uses in the system. As you can see, I have an event folder here with several different quotes, and these quotes have a variety of different elements under them. I have a rental PO, a purchase order, and then this last quote I've actually invoiced already. And we're going to look how each of these will affect the job costing tab. Before we do any of this, I just want to click into one of my quotes, and we're going to look at the job costing tab for a quote. And so you can see the job costing tab here. And I should mention that this is going to be set up by default. You're not going to have to go in and change any settings to enable this in your system. Once we release version 4.11, then you will have the job costing tab in your system. You'll also notice that it says job costing beta. And we just want to make it very clear that this is definitely going to be a feature in beta, at least for the next several months. It works very well now, but of course with any new feature in the software, we want to make sure that we get some user feedback, that we have people using it in the real world to see how it's acting and reacting to different things. So for the next couple months, it will be in beta. We do have a warning up here that says it is in beta. It should not be relied on 100% just yet, and we will welcome feedback. So right now, we're really just looking at the job costing tab as a nice sort of snapshot tool so that you can come in and get a quick look at your revenue, expenses, and profit or loss. If you are currently utilizing some other job costing program or something else that you're utilizing to do this, then we recommend still using that, especially if you have a really nice system in place. You might find the job costing tab to just be a really nice, quick snapshot. But for those of you who aren't utilizing any job costing external software or any other method right now, then you might find a lot more use from this job costing tab. So let me explain kind of the layout of the tab. Of course, you have your revenue, expenses, and profit/loss. It's going to show you what you have planned, what the actual is, and then the variance or the difference between the two. Just so you can see what the planned and actual is pulling from, if we come down here, it's going to show us the parent quote, and then it's going to break it down between the different resource types, if there are any rental POs associated, and of course this one, we see that there is, so we do have a sub-rental column. Labor, if you have any labor on the quote, which as you can see, we certainly do. And it will also break out sales tax. And there are a few other columns or rows that will show up on the job costing tab as you start using different things on your quote. So for example, if you have miscellaneous items on your quote, then there will be a new row for miscellaneous. If you have an expense sheet, which we'll look at in just a minute, it will also show a new row called other expenses that will list things that are on expense sheets. And you can drill down and see rental, and it's showing all of the rental planned revenue. You can drill down on retail, and it's showing the retail planned revenue. Subrentals, of course, that's going to show up as an expense. And Flex is going to consider POs as an actual expense and not a planned expense. And we're going to look at the difference between those two in just a minute here. We can drill down the labor and see what the planned. And also you can see, we haven't really looked at this yet, but the planned expenses. Now, this is where you're most likely going to have to do some additional setup in your system if you haven't already been utilizing the cost field when you're entering the pricing for your different inventory and service offerings. And let me show you what I mean by that. So for example, if we were to go, and let's actually look at what we have on this quote. And let's go ahead and choose one of these VL 2500s. So we'll open the item. And when you go to the pricing tab, and since I have multiple currencies in this system, I'll make sure I'm on the US dollar. As you've entered the pricing, you've probably noticed that you have a pricing field, and this is what you are going to be charging for this item. So this is the price that will show up on quotes. But then there's also a cost. And some people get confused by this because the cost isn't necessarily what this one item costs. You would put that more in the purchase or replacement cost fields. The cost that you put in a specific pricing model is more of the cost that it will cost you to operate this item, to send this item out on a job. And this is going to be very different for every one of you. For some people, maybe the cost is only going to be, the cost that it takes to prep it in the warehouse and the labor that's associated with that. So maybe it's only going to be $10, $20. Some people might want to consider the cost to be something like, well, I want to include the labor, but I also want to include, how much a fraction of what it initially cost us. So if this is a $10,000 or $15,000 unit, then maybe you want to say my cost, at least for the first year or two, is going to be $100 or $200 until I can determine that I've paid this off and it's no longer costing me anything to rent it out because I've paid it off. So again, that could be vastly different for each of you, but that's really just up to you and what kind of calculation you want to put in the cost field. But the reason why we have that cost field, and you can also see that you will find cost in your service offerings. So if we look at the pricing, you also have a cost there. And the reason that we have that and why you would want to start filling this in now is because on this job costing tab, that's where the expenses for your rental or retail or your labor and things like that are going to be calculated from. So if you really want an accurate picture of what your revenue is going to be and also what your expenses for a job are going to be, then you'll want to fill out that cost tab so that you can actually have something in this expenses field. Let me show you a quick shortcut. If you just saw me do that and thought, well, I don't want to have to open every single one of my inventory models and change the pricing, a really quick shortcut you can do is go to the inventory menu, click catalog worksheet, and this is going to show all of the inventory models that you have in your system. And then you can go over and say, I don't necessarily want to see all of the logistic information or any of this. Really, all I want to see is the name, the group, what its purchase cost is, and then the different rates. And so I could come over here and just really quickly look at what inventory model it is and change the cost and the price. And all changes are automatically saved on this page. So once you change something in the field and click out of it, that's automatically saved. You can view all of the items on one page. And so again, it's just a really quick way of being able to go through and change the cost and price for each of your inventory models without having to open each individual item. And you really want to do that, again, I just really want to make this point clear that you really want to do that if you want this job costing tab to be effective or useful to you. And so if your cost is only $5 or $10 per item, then of course the expenses would be much lower. But if your costs are a little bit higher, then as you can see here, my revenue, or at least what I'm charging the client for my rental, is just over 5,000, but my expenses are almost 1,500. You can also quickly change the cost per line item if you go to the profit or the profit markup view. And here you'll see a cost field where you can go in and manually change the cost if you want. So just a few ways that you can either have a cost by default or manually change the cost so that your expenses field will populate a little bit more accurate numbers. As you can see with my retail, I put some batteries on this quote, and for me to purchase those batteries would be $48, and then I'm going to charge $60 for all of the batteries. So that's just an example of how the revenue and the expenses fields are working. And then, of course, the profit loss section is just going to be the difference between the revenue and expenses. And so you might be asking, what's the difference between the planned and the actual? And let me show you. Once you've actually created an invoice for a job, then Flex is going to consider that the actual revenue. Planned is going to be quotes because that's just an estimate of what is going out on that job, and therefore whatever's going out on that job is going to calculate to a certain price. But Flex is only going to consider that as what is planned. And until it's actually invoiced, then it's not going to consider anything as actual yet. So let's actually go to this job, our quote for the party of this event. And just to verify, you can see that I have already created an invoice. And I didn't make any changes to the invoice, so the invoice should be for the same exact amount of the quote. So if I go to the job costing tab of this quote, then you can see not only do I have the value in the planned field, but I also have a value in the actual field. And if we go down to my rental, you can see it shows the quote itself, and it actually will show the invoice too. So the quote is planned revenue, but the invoice is my actual revenue. And so sometimes this might be different. Maybe you were planning on this much, but then when you actually send out the invoice, maybe they ended up not using a piece of gear, or maybe a piece of gear arrived on the job that wasn't working, and so your customer is demanding that you take that off the invoice. So your invoice might be a little bit less, it might be a little bit more, because maybe you added some stuff as well. So that's why we have a different column for planned and actual, and why the quote will be planned and the invoice will be the actual. You can see the expenses have followed the same because the cost for each of these rental items stayed the same on my invoice. And then for profit loss, you can see that I planned for my rental this much. That's how much I actually received. And in the overview section here, it just shows the same amount. There's no variance there. You'll notice with the sales tax, what it does is that it actually will be a planned revenue and also a planned expense. And there's no variance there because you're going to receive this, but then you're pretty much just going to have to turn right around and pay that back to the state. And then at the very bottom, of course, we have the totals of each of the different sections for your revenue, expenses, and your profit loss. And so viewing the job costing tab on a quote can be very useful, just so you can see the very specific things about that quote. But like we were showing before, you can go to an event folder as well that has multiple quotes. The quotes might have POs, the event folder might have POs of its own, or even an expense sheet. And if you go to the job costing tab there, it will show all of the different jobs, quotes, POs, etc. that are associated with this entire event folder. So if I look at my rental, it will show all three of my quotes. And again, it's just showing what's planned. And since I've only generated one invoice so far, it's only showing that one invoice in my actual rental revenue. So let's go and generate an invoice for the other quotes. So for my general session quote, I'm going to generate an invoice. And then I believe the last one I have to do is for my breakouts. And just so you can see, you can also access job costing on your invoice. Most of the time, you'll probably be looking at job costing on quotes and event folders, though, because once you get to the invoice, it's only showing the invoice. It could still be useful information to you, but I think for the most part, you'll be looking at that snapshot for quotes and event folders. So let's open our breakouts quote and generate that invoice as well. And again, I'm just doing this so that I will have a total in my actual column that matches what my planned column is as well. And again, the invoice could be a slightly different amount than the quote. I'm not going to do this in this example. I'm just going to generate invoices that match exactly what the quotes are. So let's close all those quotes, and then we'll click back over to the job costing tab to refresh. And now you can see that all of my invoices are showing, and my total for actual and planned is the same now because I've generated an invoice for each one of these quotes. And that should be the same in all of my different subcategories or my different resource types. So if I look at labor, I have a planned and an actual that match. My sub-rental is just going to stay the same because Flex is just considering that an actual expense. I also have a purchase order, which I believe is associated with this breakouts quote. And that was just for some tape. My labor should show the same as well. So the planned and actual are the same. And sales tax should do the same as well. And so now we have more accurate numbers of my actual, because now I can say that my revenue was definitely $16,525 because that's what I billed the client and that's what I should be receiving. My actual expenses should be $6,014. And then this is my actual profit. And again, of course, the revenue minus expenses is your profit. Let's show really quick how an expense sheet works as well. Now I could do an expense sheet as a child of a quote, but let's actually create an expense sheet as a child of the event folder. So I'm in the event folder tab right now. I'll click add expense sheet. And there's a couple of changes that we've made to expense sheets in version 4.11. I think you were still able to do this before if you go to the project element settings for your expense sheet. Then on the very last tab of expense sheet options or expense worksheet options, you can either say whether or not you want to have a PO number on there or an invoice number on there. So most of yours, if you create an expense sheet, you'll probably have a PO number and the invoice number fields, but I've turned those off in my system. So again, to do that, just go to the project element settings for the expense sheet. And on the last tab, you should have that option to turn those on or off. The new thing that you will see in 4.11, so none of you should have this yet, but as soon as we release 4.11, you'll see this section is where you can actually have allowed resource types on your expense sheet as well. So you can say which resource types are going to be allowed. And now when I'm adding a line, I could, if I wanted to, assign it to a specific resource type. Or I could just assign it to none. And so maybe let's just say this is a show expense and it's parking. I could put a vendor in there if I wanted to, but let's just make this simple. Just say it's a $200 expense. And really these expense sheets are more just to track your internal costs. You could or could not be charging this to your customer. It really just depends. Of course, another way to chart or to track your expenses. So for example, if I were to put a charge on my quote for parking, then I could just go to the profit view and say, well, it cost me $200 and I'm also charging the customer $200. So it's just a couple ways you could do it. You could use an expense sheet or you could put it on your quote. I just wanted to create an expense sheet so that you could see how it appears on the job costing tab. So again, let's click away from the tab and then click back to reload. And now I have a new row that's called Other Expenses. And it will list any expense sheet that I have associated with this event. And as you can see, it's actually showing it as both a planned and an actual, because it's essentially serving the same role. Just like a quote is serving as the planned expense and the invoice is serving as the actual expense, the expense sheet is just serving as both. And you can see that that has calculated into the expenses and my profit loss. So again, there's really nothing you have to do to set up the actual job costing tab. It will be there by default. But just as a quick review, if you do want these numbers to be a little bit more accurate, then you will want to go to each of your inventory models and do both a cost and a price, and you can do that quickly from your catalog worksheet. Same with your labor. We don't have a catalog worksheet for labor and other service offerings, so you will just have to open each of those and put a cost in there. But again, a lot of times that cost might be a little different per job, especially with your labor. It might depend on who you're using on that job. And so in that case, you could easily just go to the profit or the profit markup view of your quote, and you can manually change what that cost is there. And of course, the job costing tab will separate into your different resource types, sales tax as well, and expense sheets if you have any. Again, this will be released in version 4.11, and we really just want to stress that it is still in beta. So we have this pretty bold warning here that just says it should not be relied on 100% just yet. We are welcoming feedback. So if you're seeing things in the job costing tab that maybe aren't working exactly the way that you want it to, or if you feel like there might be something that you and other customers would benefit from if it was added in the job costing tab, then we would love to hear your feedback. If you do have any questions or comments about this, especially after it's released, then we invite you to our forum and just go to the webinars board where you can discuss this specific webinar. And if once this is released, if you have any specific questions that are more technical in nature, then we ask that you email support@flexrentalsolutions.com.